Showing. Okay, bread minus. So this is bread minus. Approximately 37 hours before baking. Take starter out of the fridge. Remove, discard, and feed. Leave at room temperature with lid resting on top, but unsealed. I do think this in the evening if I want a morning bake. We will call this time B minus 37 hours. B minus. There are two kinds of countdown times used for rockets. L minus time is physical, absolute time before launch. L minus 24 hours means launch takes place in 24 hours. T minus, the more familiar phrase, is flexible. T minus is a system to mark points at which launch actions occur. It can factor in starts and stops, points in which the countdown is paused. It represents the time allotted to do a task rather than absolute time. Bread making is a T minus style time. B minus 24, B 25 hours. Split a baking portion off from the starter and remove excess discard from mainline starter. Feed both mainline and baking cultures and leave at room temp with lid resting on. For my bread, I take about 10 to 15 grams of starter, adding 25 grams of each flour and lukewarm water. This makes a 50% hydration starter. The water should be dechlorinated if possible. Boiling and cooling works. Leave the mainline starter for a few hours, then refrigerate. Get on with your day. B minus 13 hours. In response to William Willett's 1907 pitching of daylight savings time, one irate newspaper reader responded that the reformation of time proposes to put us to bed and get us up by act of Parliament. Personally, I like to choose my own time for these operations. Before the late 19th century, the act of accurately measuring time was limited mostly to specific groups: sailors, merchants, the bourgeoisie. Our ancestors who worked the land had less need for precise time and followed external prompts and signs for when it was time to work. The baking starter should have grown and become gluteny. After practice, you may find this happens before the 12th hour allotted here. Skip an hour if you need, or delay an hour if you need. After practice, you'll know when the dough is ready. It'll feel good to stir, like glue. Boil and let cool 350 grams of water to remove the chlorine. If you do not have chlorinated main water, or you're using bottled water, just get it up to room temperature. Add the starter to the water with a big pinch of salt, and then mix in 500 grams of good bread flour. Mix the dough together into a claggy mess. There should be no dry flour. Cover and leave at room temperature. B minus 12 hours. The reference manual for the Space Shuttle launch countdown covers 5 volumes and roughly 5,000 pages of instructions. Volume 1 covers everything from up to the beginning of a 3-day countdown. Volume 2 contains the actual instructions for the launch. Volume 3 covers what to do if a launch is scrubbed, and how to recycle preparations for another attempt. Have a good night, Brawl. Thank you for hanging out. Volume 4 is the itemized instructions for every task, initiated in Volume 2. Volume 5 is contingency procedures and emergency instructions. Some friends have commented that sourdough baking feels like 5,000 pages of instructions, precise measurements, and exactitudes. It's true that with a 37-hour prep time, it's a long process, but it's really very simple, and many steps are forgiving of inaccuracies. It's not rocket science, really. After waiting an hour, the dough should have come together and gotten slightly smoother. Wet your hands with a little water and lift one side of the dough, fold over itself. Turn 90 degrees and repeat. Once all 4 corners have been folded, cover and leave for half an hour. Then repeat same series of folds. Then leave your dough overnight. Sleep well. B minus 30 minutes. The take-up of accurate time coincides with the movement of workers from farms and time-forgiving jobs into factories and shift patterns, with human managers in place of nature. Workers start to wake up before sunrise, to arrive at the workplace on time. What is on time? It is entirely artificial. The partition of day into regimented sections, with a deadline every morning. The 9-to-5 workday is based on an outdated assumption of factory work. For what reason does someone actually need to start work at that time? Far better to start work only when one is required by the nature of whatever they have that day. In the morning, your dough should have risen 2 times to 3 times. You should be able to see it still forming air bubbles. If you watch for a few minutes, prepare an empty bowl and a decent-sized bit of baking parchment. Flour a smooth work surface. I use a glass chopping board. And turn the dough out on it, scraping the sticky strands out of the bowl. Dust the surface of the dough with more flour. And repeat the corner folding from before. Absolutely love sourdough, so I might have to watch this again afterwards and actually make sourdough. Try not to work too slowly, as every second will make the dough want to stick more. After folding corners over 4 times, flip the dough over to put the seams on the bottom. Cup the sides and pull them under the dough towards you, working around to form it into a smooth ball. Transfer to the baking parchment. Place in the clean bowl and cover loosely. B minus 15 minutes. Preheat the oven at gas mark 8. Gas mark 8? They're using grams. Maybe that's a terminology that's used in like European like stoves or something. Okay, gas mark is an oven temperature scale used in the UK. Okay. UK, Ireland, that's why. Originally based on the regular proprietary temperature system, GM1 is equal to 275 degree Fahrenheit. GM2 is 300 Fahrenheit, and each step goes up another 25. Below GM1, each halving is 25 lower. So GM1 half is 250 Fahrenheit, which I don't think ovens even go that low. I think mine only goes like, well, maybe in dehydrate you can turn it lower, but usually it's 350 is the lowest. GM1 quarter is 225 Fahrenheit. Gas mark is a deeply ridiculous scale. Yes, it is. That somehow still exists in the 21st century. A similar scale, Stufe, exists in Germany and measures in 25 Celsius steps. Starting from Stufe 1 at 150. My oven uses gas marks, so does my recipe to my chagrin. You may want to preheat to 450 degrees instead. Once the oven is lit, put lidded baking vessel in the oven to warm up too. I use an old enameled cast iron, a Dutch oven, which holds good heat but is heavy. B-0. Bread time, baby. Lift off. Or baking commence. Carefully remove baking vessel from preheated oven. Transfer dough on parchment into a hot container. Score the top of the dough with a sharp knife to allow a clean expansion point where it rises. Lid the container and place back in oven. Bake for 23 minutes with lid on. This is one of the few precise numbers in this recipe, but you may need to figure out a number that works for you, based on baking vessel, starter consistency, and oven heat, as well as altitude, actually. Like back when I was living in Utah, everything like cooked faster because the altitude was like a mile high in the air. There's a quote about countdowns from the science writer Willie Ley. People involved in countdowns always say that the last 20 minutes are the worst. By that time, everything that needs doing has been done. And therefore, everybody has 20 minutes in which to think of what may not have been done, or else what could possibly go wrong. The bread's in the oven now, out of our hands. B plus 23 minutes. Carefully remove the lid from your baking vessel. The dough should have risen, but not yet taken on color. Bake in oven for a further 21 to 22 minutes, until browned and hollow sounding to a tap. Remove from oven, leave for a moment. Then transfer with parchment to a wire rack to cool. When cold enough to handle, peel off parchment. Allow to cool further, because the dough can get messy if cut when still warm. But there's nothing like warm bread. So I won't criticize it if you try a bite now. Mission success. Hopefully. Experiment with adding herbs, spices, olive oil, seeds, or making rolls or different shapes or different flours. I think it's mind-boggling to think about how a wet mass of water and crushed wheat turns into bread. But the long process is worth it, I think. To point at a fresh loaf of bread and say, I did that. Chomp. Honestly, baking sourdough has done a lot for my mood during months of lockdown. Whilst it doesn't require an exact wake-up time, having to get up within a few hours window has been good, forcing me to at least sort out my sour, yeasty child. Sorry, yeasty child is not something I ever thought I would say. Oh, welcome, Quinn. In the same way, caring for a pet forces you to care for yourself. Thanks for listening to my tangents during this recipe. Happy baking. So that was Bread Minus, which was a interesting one. They said you got a recipe for how to make sourdough, as well as learning about how rocket countdowns work and how daylight savings time ended up being a thing.